hard at school so you're going to get on well at your exams. And get on well at your exams so you can either go to college or you can get a good job. And work hard at your job so that you'll get promoted. And then someday, when you've all of that completed, so somewhere way over the rainbow, you're going to have a nice car and a nice house, and you'll be what we call successful. And then when you reach a level of success, that then you'll be happy or you'll be satisfied with your life. So that's kind of the narrative or the way that we're told that it works. So for myself as a young boy, when I was growing up in Clamars in County Mayo, I kind of played the game, I suppose, as it was meant to be played. You know, I worked hard at school and I did well in my leaving cert, and I was lucky enough to get into pharmacy in Trinity, and so I qualified as a pharmacist. And then my career followed, you know, a typical path for a pharmacist in Ireland, and that's really consisted of, you know, you become a support pharmacist first, and then after a few years you become a supervising pharmacist, and then after a few years you become a superintendent pharmacist, and then after another few years I was lucky enough that a pharmacy came for sale in Galway, and bought that pharmacy. And after a few years, when that was successful and that was going well, I decided, sure, I'll open up another pharmacy. And then another few years that was going well, and sure, I said I'll open up a third pharmacy. And at that stage, I would have thought to myself, 3 pharmacies, you know, that to me would sound like a fairly successful career. And so the theory behind that, I suppose, would be then at that stage that I should be feeling very successful, I should be feeling high levels of well-being, of life satisfaction, and of happiness. But the reality of the situation, I suppose, was that at that time, when I had 3 businesses I was running, that I was quite stressed and I was anxious, and there weren't enough hours in the day to do all the tasks that I had to do. I was really, really busy, and my diet would have been quite poor, and exercise wouldn't really have featured at all in my life, and my energy was low. And by the time I got to come home in the evening to my beautiful wife, Kathy, my lovely 3 kids, I was too tired and too preoccupied to engage with them in the way that I would have wanted to engage with them. And so for me, that led to a lot of disillusionment and to a lot of kind of soul searching. Because as I saw it, you know, I had played the game the way it was meant to be played, but I felt, geez, you know, there just has to be more to it than this. This can't be what it's all about. So, you know, hands up, maybe anyone that can relate to that story, or that story makes sense to, or maybe you have your own version of that story, or you're going through it at the moment, or you've gone through it. I think it's a kind of familiar enough scenario. So at that stage, what I did is I became interested in this whole area. So I studied things like stress management and yoga and clinical hypnosis and applied positive psychology. And I became fascinated by this whole area of well-being and lifestyle, and how, you know, things like achievements and accomplishments and goals can impact on our well-being and impact on our lifestyle. So I'm just going to move this. Now, hopefully that all has moved on for you. So before I get into the nitty-gritty or the meat of it all, you know, I want to make it very clear that, of course, goals are really, really important in our lives. And they're very important to give us a sense of focus and to give our lives a sense of direction. And I'm sure we're all familiar with this phrase, you know, if you don't know where you're going, then any road is going to get you there. And there's any amount of techniques and tools and strategies that are out there that all, I suppose, have common themes. And that's really not the area that we're going to go into this morning, not the nuts and bolts of how to set goals. But what we're going to do is going to look at goals and look at them from a point of view as how they affect our well-being and how they affect our overall levels of happiness. And so as a general agenda of what we're going to follow this morning, this is what it's going to look like. First of all, we're going to look at 3 potential pitfalls that we can fall into when we're setting goals from a well-being and from a happiness scenario. Secondly, we're going to look at what's called the success equation. We're going to look and see what that is and just examine, is it right or is it correct? Thirdly, we're going to look at a happiness pie chart. And then finally, we're going to look at a model of well-being that's called the PERMA-V model. That's a kind of a science-backed, research-based model that tells us what areas we should be addressing if we really do want to address our levels of well-being. Does that sound okay, guys? Nod the heads. Yeah, lovely, good stuff. And as I say, if you do want to use the chat box at any stage, if there's anything going on, by all means engage with the chat box there, that'll be great. So first section is just, the potential pitfalls or the potential challenges that we can face when it comes to the whole goal setting process. So typically what happens when we set goals is, we reflect on last year's goals. So this time of year, we often reflect back on the previous year. And whatever metrics we use to measure last year's goals, and that's usually things like euros earned, for example, or it could be kilograms lost if you're losing a bit of weight. It could be kilometers ran or kilometers cycled. And we look at those metrics and what we achieved last year, and we say, okay, that was what we did last year. So this year, I want to increase that by, let's say, 10% or 25% or 50% or whatever the case may be. So it could be I ran a marathon last year and I'm going to run 2 this year. Or it could be I grew my business by 10% last year. I'd like to grow it by 20% this year. And that then is, the first pitfall that we can fall into. Before we know it, we can be on this treadmill of wanting more and more from ourselves and more for our lives, and that everything has to be bigger and faster and stronger than it was last year. And without even knowing it, we spend most of our lives on this treadmill of we're just busy, and if we're not busy, we feel that there's something wrong with us. It's constantly go, go, go. And I came across this quote somewhere, and I don't even know the exact words of the quote, but the general gist of it is that we need to destroy this notion or this idea that we need to be constantly working and constantly grinding and constantly striving to be successful. And that we have to embrace the concept that rest and recovery and reflection are essential parts towards progressing towards a life of happiness or a life of life satisfaction or high well-being. So growth and challenge, which is what we get from our goals, are of course really, really good for us, but they're not the whole story, and we have to put them into a perspective, and we have to see them in a general context. So that's the first little pitfall that we can fall into. The second one then is, if you're familiar with the whole goal setting process, which I'm sure we all are, that it's recommended that when we set goals that are SMART. And SMART goals are ones that are specific, they're measurable, they're achievable, they're relevant, and they're time bound. So that's what a SMART goal is. So an example of a SMART goal would be, I want to run 10 kilometers by June the 30th, 2021. So that's very specific and it's very measurable. We know what 10 kilometers is and we know what it looks like. It's achievable, depends on your level of fitness. It's relevant to you and it's time bound. We want to do this by the 30th of June. So that's an example of a SMART goal. Now, what I found personally was that in some domains of my life, you're told it's recommended to have balance in your life and that you set maybe one personal goal, one family goal, and one work-related goal. What I found was that in some domains of my life, it was difficult to set a SMART goal. So for example, one year, the goal I had for my family was that we would all go to Florida for 2 weeks and we'd go to Disneyland or Disney World. I'm not sure which one this is, but we'd go to Disney in Florida and we'd have a lovely time for the 2 weeks. But when I started reflecting on that goal, I was thinking, there's little point us going to Florida and having a fantastic time for 2 weeks if for the other 50 weeks of the year that we weren't really interacting or we weren't engaging, or if I wasn't being present with my wife and my kids when I was with them. And if I was to really think of what I would want me and my family, or what I want for a goal for my family, it was more that I'd love to have a kind and a caring and a loving, supportive environment in our house, and that we'd have lots of fun and lots of laughter together. And when you think of that kind of a goal, you can see how there's no real endpoint to that goal. That's not really a SMART goal. It's not specific, it's not measurable, and it's not time bound. There's no endpoint to us. So it's just a way of being, it's a way that I wanted to be with my family, with my wife and with my kids. And sometimes when we focus on goals too much, there can be too much of a focus on what the outcome of the goal is and not enough focus on the process. So that's the second potential pitfall that we can fall into when it comes to setting goals. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Yeah.
Good stuff. And then the third pitfall is kind of related to the second one. In coaching and in psychology, there's an exercise that we can do, and it's called the deathbed exercise, or it's also called the eulogy exercise. And in this exercise, it may sound quite morbid, but it's not really. You imagine that you've taken your final breath, and either people are at your deathbed or there's someone and they're at your funeral, and they're reading your eulogy. And you're asked to consider, well, what would I like them to be saying about me? And the idea behind the exercise is that it's a way to kind of ascertain what your real values or what your values are in life. And then you bring you back to the present, you take yourself back to the present, and then you go about and you live your life true to those values, so that when it does come to your final hours, that you have lived a life true to your values. So if we go back to the example of going to Florida with my family, so I've no interest in any of you showing up at my funeral whenever it happens and saying, isn't he a great lad? You know what? He brought his family to Florida in 2018. Isn't that fantastic? That really would mean nothing to me. I'd be delighted if people came to my funeral and said, you know, Séamus was a great family man, and I often saw his wife and his kids together, and yeah, I just thought they were a great little unit, and I often heard them see them walking down the road, and they were, they were happy and they're having a bit of a laugh together. And that would be very meaningful for me, for someone to say that at my funeral. Or similarly, if it comes to, we'll say the pharmacy here, it would mean nothing to me if people said, that pharmacy Séamus had in Galway, that pharmacy had the highest turnover in the whole of the country. Would you believe that? Isn't that fantastic? It would mean absolutely nothing to me. Whereas if someone said, Séamus's pharmacy in Galway, they give fantastic service to all their customers that come in. They treated everyone equally, and they had a fabulous staff. And the staff thought really highly of Séamus and thought really highly of each other. And every time you walk in the door of that pharmacy, there was just a lovely atmosphere in there. So that would be far more meaningful for me, for someone to say that about me, rather than going to Florida or my turnover. And sometimes when it comes to goals, we can become far too focused on doing stuff and far less focused on being someone. So those are three potential pitfalls that we can fall into when it comes to the whole goal setting process. So I'm going to ask you to have a look at this and just to kind of consider this for a couple of minutes. I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes. So you can either write this down for yourselves, or you can pop them into the chat box if you want to get a little bit of a chat going. So the first question is, to what extent do you believe, so it's a deeply held belief in a lot of us, we have to be busy, we have to be working, and we have to be doing stuff all the time. So to what extent do you believe that you need to be constantly working and constantly grinding to be successful? Just to consider that, and maybe pop something in the chat box if you'd like. Secondly, does an excess focus on the future interfere with your ability to be present? Because oftentimes when we set goals, our focus is on the future and not enough on the present. And then thirdly, are you living the values that you want to be remembered for? So just thinking of that deathbed or that eulogy exercise. So I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes, maybe just to sit back and have a little think about that. And we'll be back to you then in a little sec. And you can pop stuff in the chat box there if you'd like. I'll put on a nice little bit of music for 2 minutes. Now, guys, I hope that was okay there. I'm going to turn this slide off. So I can see lots of people here saying that they're not going to turn on their videos, their video feed because they're in their pajamas, so that's fine. And I do see it kind of resonating a bit with people, that whole idea of, you know, being through the journey of too much of what was not important and too little of what is really important. And so it's really important, you know, that we do take time out to reflect on this kind of things. As I say, we can spend an awful lot of time on this treadmill of just being busy and moving on to the next thing and the next thing without taking time out to reflect. Yeah, a lot of people agreeing that that's something very much ingrained with themselves, that it, you know, it has to be all about go, go, go. And excess focus on the future, also an excess focus on the past. Love you guys, and thanks for using the chat box there. That really makes this nice and kind of interactive. So that's section number 1 done. So we're only going to be doing 4 sections. So that's the first part. The second thing we're going to look at then is what we call the success equation. And with the success equation, if we ask people, you know, why they want to achieve any goals in their life, or why they want to make a particular change in their life, and that could be a new car, or getting promoted, or increasing their income. And if you ask them, well, why do you want that? And depending on what the goal is, they'll give you a particular answer. And then if you keep digging and keep saying, well, why is that important to you? And why do you want that? And why is that important to you? And if you keep going, the very last why that's important to you, or why do you want that, the very last answer that people come up, the very last question is always, because then I'd be happy. And it seems like we have this belief in ourselves that to be happy, we need to get something, we need to have something, or we need to achieve something that's external to ourselves. Now, most people believe, and I want you to imagine yourself in this scenario, most people believe that if they were filthy rich, if they had a beautiful yacht and a fantastic mansion, and maybe were married to a Hollywood star and had a really exciting social life, that would literally be the life of their dreams. But we know that there's countless examples of people, we'll say Hollywood stars, or of sporting heroes, or of business entrepreneurs who have been hugely successful and who lead hugely successful lives in the traditional meaning of the word, and people that are held up as role models to the rest of us, and people who we're told we should emulate what they've done and what they've achieved. But when you scratch beneath the surface, we see that quite often they lead dysfunctional lives, and that they may be sad or lonely or depressed. And quite often they're fearful that everything can be taken away from them at a minute's notice. And they might have a string of broken relationships, there might be multiple addictions, and no sense of meaning and no sense of purpose in their lives. So the research shows us that oftentimes the things that we desire, the things that we feel we desire, have little or no effect on our happiness, and little or no effect on our feelings of life satisfaction or well-being. And that as human beings, that we're very, very bad predictors of what will bring us happiness. So if you ask people, you know, off the cuff, if you say to people, what's one thing, grant you one single wish, what's one thing you'd love? Most people will come up with the answer, and they'll say, oh geez, I'd just love to win the lotto. All my problems will be solved, I'd love to win the lotto. But we know from research that beyond having the necessities of life, and once we can meet our basic needs, whether we have 50,000 euros or 500,000 euros or 50 million euros in the bank, it has a negligible effect on our overall level of happiness or life satisfaction. And whether if we drive a Merc or if we drive a Banger, or whether we're rich or poor, that our chances of being happy are pretty much the same. And this belief that we have that we'll only be satisfied or we'll only achieve happiness when we just get something or achieve something or have something external to ourselves, and that our happiness and our well-being exist somewhere in the future, way over the rainbow, that's a deeply ingrained belief in us. And when it's challenged, then sometimes people find it difficult to accept that the answer is really, it's much, much closer to home than that. So, you know, in presentations, when people are giving talks, they often stop at a particular point and say, you know, if there's one thing that you get from this presentation, well, here it is, this is the one. So I'm going to say that now. If there's one thing that you learned from all of this morning, then this is the one that's really important, that's key to us all. So in the exact same way that in the 1500s, the human beings used to believe that the Earth was at the very, very center of the universe, until a guy called Copernicus, if you remember him from your junior cert science, or in my case, it would be my inter-cert science. If you remember Copernicus, he discovered that the exact opposite was true. So he discovered that the sun was at the center of our solar system and that the Earth revolves around the sun. For generations and generations, human beings have believed that their happiness and their life satisfaction orbited around their success. So they had to be successful first, and then that they achieve their levels of happiness. But over the last 10 years or so, there have been an enormous shift in what we know in psychology, an enormous shift in our levels of awareness. And this has been even greatly accelerated with the whole advent of COVID-19 and the global pandemic, where people begin to awaken and begin to realize what actually matters. When all the other stuff is stripped away from you and you don't have all the other stuff, people actually begin to realize what it is that causes them to achieve high levels of well-being, happiness, and life satisfaction. And so we've discovered, just like Copernicus, we've discovered that not only is our happiness and our well-being dependent on us achieving success, but that not only is that incorrect, but that the exact opposite is true. That when we achieve high levels of happiness or well-being or life satisfaction, whatever term you want to put in it, then you are far more likely to become successful, and not the other way around. So high levels of well-being have a positive influence on almost every single health outcome, every single personal outcome, every single business outcome that we can measure. And this guy looks fairly happy, doesn't he? And he looks like he's fairly satisfied with what's going on at the moment. But we know that when we experience high levels of well-being, it leads to improvements in our health. So our immune system functions better. We're better able to fight off colds and flus. Our cardiovascular system functions better. We've higher levels of energy. We experience lower levels of stress. We experience reduced chronic pain. And we can even be shown to live longer, to spend more years on the planet than if we experience lower levels of well-being and happiness. From a work point of view, and this is why so many workplaces are so interested in the whole area of well-being and about increasing the well-being of their employees and colleagues. From a work point of view, when we experience high levels of well-being, we're more productive at work. We receive higher customer service ratings. We're more likely to be promoted. If we are promoted, we're more likely to make better leaders. We're less likely to quit. We're less likely to burn out, and we have greater job satisfaction. From a personal point of view, we have more fulfilling relationships. We have a wider and a better level of social support. We're more likely to experience positive emotions. We're more engaged with our life, and we're more likely to experience flow. And you know, this may sound like a list of wishful thinking or a list that we pulled out of the sky. But there's actually studies and research to show that all of those benefits do accrue to people who experience high levels of well-being and high levels of happiness. And when you look at a list like that, you think, how could you not possibly want all of that for yourself? As I say, there's hundreds of studies then out there showing that all of this is not pie in the sky, but all actually factual. And just to illustrate the point, I just picked out three particular ones that I kind of like. So one of them is called the Nun Study. And the Nun Study had a look at the diaries of 180 nuns. And they studied them from 1917 for the following 50 years. And they examined the diaries to see to what extent the nuns expressed positive content in their diaries. And they took that in to be a measure of the level of well-being of the individual nuns. And what they found was that 90% of those who expressed mainly positive content or higher level of positive content lived to be 85 years and more. So 90% of those, whereas only 34% of those who expressed either negative or neutral content mainly lived to be that age. So that shows the increased longevity. And it was thought, it was estimated that those nuns who were experiencing higher levels of well-being, that they're lived for on average 7 years more. So that's a huge increase in your longevity. And the reason that that study was meant to be a bit of a landmark one or so important was because they were all living in the same convent. And as a result, they all had the same diets and they had the same routines and they lived in the same environment. So all other elements of their lives were kind of standardized. A second interesting one was where they assessed the well-being of college students who were in their fresher years. So they were just starting off in college. And then they re-engaged them or they followed them 17 years later. And what they found was that those students who in their fresher years measured high levels of well-being, 17 years later had greater incomes and had more successful careers than their counterparts who experienced lower levels of well-being. And this study found that it was well-being and not the intelligence of the students that determined the level of career success that they achieved. So that's kind of an interesting one as well. And the last one then for the times that are in it with COVID-19, this one tells us, they took 350 patients and they divided them into two cohorts. And one of the cohorts induced a positive emotional state in them, and the other cohort induced a negative emotional state in them. And then they inoculated them all with a nasal spray that contains the common cold virus. And what they found was that those who were in a positive emotional state were 3 times more likely to develop the signs and the symptoms of the common cold as opposed to those who were in a negative or neutral emotional state. So the benefits are enormous and they're far reaching and they extend into every single domain of your life. And so back to this slide, it's our well-being that increases our chances of success and not the other way around. And as human beings, we are really, really bad predictors, unfortunately, of what it is that boosts our happiness and boosts our levels of well-being. So we know, for example, that exercise is probably one of the greatest health interventions that you can make. It's really good mentally, it's really good physically, it's really good to relieve stress. And super for your overall level of well-being. But we often interpret exercise as being strenuous and effortful and boring. We know that watching TV excessively can make us completely miserable, but we interpret it as being relaxing and we interpret it as being pleasant. We know that meditating is really good for stress levels. It's very beneficial for anxiety. It improves our emotional agility, our emotional intelligence, really good for our well-being, but we find it boring and we find it difficult. Yum, yum. We know that sugary foods are detrimental to our health, but we often crave them and find them very, very tempting. We know that social media can leave us feeling very dissatisfied with ourselves, but we have this constant urge to keep checking and checking and checking the feed. So we're really, really bad predictors of what it is that causes us to be happy and what it is that boosts our levels of well-being. So we're going to have a look and see what does the science actually tell us about that. But before we do, a couple of questions here. I'm just going to give it 2 to 3 minutes maybe to have a look at these and to engage with these ones. On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you rate your current level of well-being? If you want to write that down maybe yourself, 1 means that you're struggling or you're finding things really, really difficult. 10 means that you're flourishing and thriving in all areas of your life. And just to get maybe a feel for how people are feeling at the moment, if you wouldn't mind popping that in the chat box, that'd be great. And secondly, then, could you list 5 experiences? We say we're bad predictors of what causes us to be happy and what boosts your levels of well-being. But could we list 5 things that cause you personally to experience happiness or higher levels of well-being? So just go and give that a couple of minutes, maybe. I'll put on a little bit of music. Just 2 to 3 minutes at that as well. So when it comes to measuring our well-being, giving ourselves a score on that, I see 8, 6, 8, 5, 6, 7, 7, 7, 7 or 8, 8, and 8. 7.5, 7. So they're possibly speaking to the converted here. They're all quite good scores. The interesting thing about well-being then, and when we score well-being, is that it tends to ebb and flow. So it can ebb and flow throughout the day, throughout our weeks, throughout our months. So someone says here, a successful day is achieving 110% of what I set out to do. And they refer to themselves, or their husband refers to them as a project creep. So that's a loss of no stress to put on yourself, really. Someone I definitely thought that I had to work 24/7 or else it was letting the business down. And I was in a constant state of higher levels of stress. This is ingrained in all of us from our parents that a good work ethic brings good rewards. Previously, I was not living my values as I had not understood what they were. I now have a clear view of what my values are, and I'm trying to live these every day. I start each day with a plan, and for some reason, the phone could ring and I may have to go on a different journey to help someone else out. Lovely. And then a few things that people do then to boost their happiness or to boost their well-being. Sorry, is the music interfering there, or can you hear me okay? Okay? Yeah. So walking the dog during COVID, getting up early, meeting with family and friends who share my values and want to enjoy life, going for lovely walks with my husband and friends, laughter, hearing my children laughing with each other rather than at each other, very good. Totally agree with what makes us happy and content, or things we don't always feel like doing, spending time with family and friends, exercising, listening to music or reading, creating a happy, welcoming home, engaging with people, meeting neighbours, yoga, eating healthy, nature, laughter and fun. So loads of stuff going on there. It's interesting to see other people's perspective and other people's suggestions and points of view with this. So what I think I'll do now for you, maybe take a little break at the moment. So if we could break for 10 minutes, maybe would that be okay? So it's now 10 past 10 and maybe break till 20 past. We'll start back again at 20 past if you'd like to get a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or use the loo or something. Would that be okay? 10 minutes? Happy enough with that? Lovely. Okay, see you then, guys. Off. Yeah. Just when I see this, a special shout out now to Sheila, because Sheila, where she is on the other side of the world, it's actually 4 a.m. in the morning. So she has to get top of the class this morning. 4 a.m. That's something else, Sheila. So the third area then that we're going to look at then is called the happiness pie chart. Now, when I first became interested in this whole area of well-being and lifestyle, and to be honest, I thought it was all a bit airy-fairy and maybe a little bit kind of hippy-dippy, and that there wasn't much substance to it. And the term well-being itself, even, there's lots of misunderstanding about what well-being actually is, because the term itself is bandied about a lot and used in loads of different contexts. And even if you ask people to tell you what well-being actually is, people have a general sense about what it is, but find it quite hard to actually define it. Because I've seen well-being crystals, I've seen well-being tarot cards, and I've seen well-being in articles or in journals that have the full rigors of medical science behind them. So as a result, there's a lot of confusion about what we mean when we're talking about well-being. So when I started looking into this area, I was delighted to know that there's about 25 years of scientific research gone into the whole area of well-being. And that research has given us loads of tools and loads of studies and loads of techniques that if we apply them to our lives, that we can be confident that they will actually boost our levels of well-being. And one of the landmark studies in this whole area is called the Minnesota Twin Registry Study. And this was a study of 2,000 twins, identical twins who were separated at birth. And the long and the short of this, what it found was that 50% of the variability between one person's well-being and another's, that 50% of that comes from their genes or their genetics. And as such, it's a fixed entity. So, in other words, some people are born taller, some people are born small. Well, some people can be born with higher levels of well-being than others. And that's just something that's a fixed amount, and there's nothing much you can do about that. 10% of our overall level of well-being then comes from our life circumstances. And what our life circumstances mean are whether we're married or single, whether we're working or unemployed, whether we're rich or poor, whether we live in an urban area or a rural area. Now, this comes as a huge surprise to a lot of people, because most people believe that their life circumstances are absolutely key to their levels of happiness, their levels of life satisfaction, and their levels of well-being. But the fact is that once we have the basics of what we need, whether we're rich or poor, or whether we're beautiful or plain, or whether we're married or single, makes barely a difference to your level of happiness or well-being. And that leaves then 40%. And 40% can be accounted for by what we call our intentional activities. And our intentional activities essentially are how we think and how we feel and what we do on a daily basis. So what this really tells us is that if we compare happy people to unhappy people, the main difference is not necessarily their achievements or their possessions, but their habitual thoughts and their habitual behaviors. So the big surprise in this, I suppose, is that 10%, that our life circumstances are only really responsible for about 10% of our overall level of happiness, life satisfaction, or well-being. And the reason that this is thought to be such a low figure is because as human beings, the reason that we're kind of rulers of the planet is not necessarily because we're the smartest kids on the block, but because we have an enormous capability or enormous ability to adapt to changing circumstances. So no matter what happens and no matter what has happened throughout history on the planet, mankind seems to be able to adapt. So whether that's drought or famine or war or pestilence or climate change or COVID-19, mankind seems to be able to adapt to these difficult circumstances. And that's an advantage. But it does come with a cost, or it comes with a disadvantage. And the disadvantage or the downside is that we also adapt to the pleasant things in our lives. So that's new car, for example, or the new house, or the raise that you got that felt absolutely wonderful at the time. The enjoyment of that quickly fades into the background, and we tend to take good things in our life for granted. And over the passage of time, these things tend to fade into the background, and they become our new normal. And so this is how, or they call this the hedonic treadmill, that was once wonderful, we now take for granted. And as a result, to feel that level of satisfaction again, we need more money and more deals and more possessions. And then we're on the treadmill of wanting more and more and more. It also means then that we have a thing called a well-being set point. And the well-being set point means that there is a level of well-being or life satisfaction that we experience throughout most of our lives that doesn't tend to change all that much. And as everyone overestimates the effects that positive or negative life events has on that set point. So what that means, for example, is let's say this is my set point level of well-being that I experienced throughout most of my life. And then something positive happens to me. So for example, I meet my lovely wife, Kathy, and we fall in love and my well-being goes through the roof. But no disrespect to Kathy, but over a period of months or years, we kind of get used to each other and that becomes our new normal. So we adapt, and my well-being, as her well-being also, I would say I'm nothing special. So her well-being also comes back to its set point level. And then something else positive could happen to us. So for example, we might have kids and well-being goes through the roof, and then but over time it just becomes a new norm and we settle into it and their well-being comes back to its set point level. And let's say something negative happens, so there's a death in the family, and so well-being decreases, but we tend to be able to cope with these circumstances and we get used to things and well-being comes to its set point level. Or we have financial difficulties and well-being decreases but tends to come back up to its set point level again. So it's like a magnet that attracts us back to this set point level, and that tends not to change throughout our life all that much. And the only way that we can change or boost our level of well-being from that set point level to a higher set point level is by engaging in intentional activities. And intentional activities, as I say, are things how we think, how we feel, and what we do on a daily basis. So we might think that our well-being will be increased by getting a new car, or a foreign holiday, or an extension to your house, or a new partner. But all these things, we tend to adapt to them, and the way we boost our level of well-being and go up to a different level is by engaging with intentional activities, how we think, how we feel, and what we do on a daily basis. So another little bit of something to ponder, something to think about there. Can you think of 3 things that you once desired, that you really thought were going to make a huge difference to you, but once you gain them or achieve them, you now take them for granted? There could be something small, something big, and I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes maybe to have a little think about that. And I'll put on a little bit of music there again, just a minute or two to have a little think about that. And you can pop them in the chat box if you can. So just maybe something that you really, really want. So it could be something like a car or a possession, something that you really felt was going to make a difference. And when you achieved this, maybe you had a bit of a thrill initially, but over time it just kind of faded into the background and you took it for granted. So Patricia has a couple in there, lovely. So we're talking about things like a new car, house, retirement, same job in a different place, bicycle, kayak, truck. New car, new phone, I can relate to that, new kitchen. Those kinds of things. There's an initial thrill when we achieve them or when we get them. But over time, I often think of a new car, you get a new car and you're really conscious that it's nice and clean and there's no scratches on it. And the first scratch then drives you crazy. And then after a couple of months, the scratches all over it and you don't tend to even notice them anymore. So we just kind of adapt. Lovely. So we get the general picture with that, I think, guys. And that brings us on then to our final section, which is about the PERMA-V model. And the PERMA-V model, I suppose, is a model that we can use to boost our overall level of well-being. And what people often say to me is, you know, Séamus, geez, that's really, really interesting, that whole well-being stuff, and I find that fascinating. And to be quite honest, I'd love to boost my level of well-being. I'd really, really love to do it. But I'm a bit confused, and I don't really know where to start. I don't know what I should do. Do you have any kind of a format or a roadmap or some sort of a model that I could use that I could be confident, if I invested my time and invested my energy into this, that I'd be confident that I would actually see boosts to my overall level of well-being? So it turns out that there's a guy called Martin Seligman, and he is referred to as the founding father of this whole area of the science of well-being, the study of positive psychology. And he became president of the American Psychological Association in 1996. And he came up with a model for well-being that is widely accepted. He came up with a model called PERMA. And then other researchers came along after him and said, that makes sense, but I think you missed out on one. So they've all settled on a model now that we can call, depending on what parts of the world we're in, we can call it PERMA-V or PERMA-H. And what this does, it gives us 6 areas in our lives that we can address. And if we address these areas, we can see a boost in our overall level of well-being. And just to go through then what that model is with you. So the P stands for positive emotions. So what the idea here is, the more positive emotions that you experience in your life, the higher the level of well-being that you'll experience will be. So positive emotions are things like excitement, enthusiasm, love, joy, awe, interest, pride. So there's loads of, those are a list of the positive emotions. And the reason positive emotions are important for us is not just because they feel good, which they do, but because they actually change how our brain works. So they change the part of our brains that we have access to. They also change the part of our nervous system that becomes predominant. And as a result, they change how we interact with the world, how we interact with other people, and they also change how we interpret the world. There's loads of different tools and different techniques that we can use to boost our level of well-being or our level of positive emotions. And so the idea here is that we'd have some kind of a mood strategy. So some kind of tools and tips in our back pocket that we could use if ever we feel our emotions aren't great and we prefer to pick a more empowering or a more positive emotion. So maybe if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat box a couple of things that you could think of that you could do that would boost your mood. So something that you could do, you weren't feeling great. What's your kind of go-to when it comes to improving your mood? Any ideas you could pop into the chat box there? A lovely walk by the sea, lovely dancing, to watch or read something inspirational. Lovely, walking in nature, sea swimming, fresh air, listening to music, chatting with a loved one, a run in the woods, time in the garden. Do something voluntary, absolutely, this is the volunteer. Time with the dog. A walk or a chat, watching birds feeding. So nature is featuring quite a lot there. So we can see from that, you know, there are things that we can do so that we don't have to be at the mercy of our emotions. But when we experience an emotion that we don't necessarily want, or we don't want to dwell on, or we don't want to take over our day or our week, that there are little tools and techniques that we can have that we can change our mood and change our emotions. It's important to be aware of that we're not necessarily at the mercy of our emotions, but we can change them. So in positive psychology terms, one of the great tools that we can use in this area is to have a practice of gratitude. So to have things in our lives that, you know, we bring to mind that we're grateful we have, and to view the world through a lens of gifts rather than to viewing the world through a lens of problems and difficulties. So that's the whole area of positive emotions. The E then stands for engagement. And what engagement means is, you know, being fully present in what you're doing. So rather than just being here and ticking the boxes and punching in the time and watching the clock to see what time it's over at, you know, for example, on the call, so are you actually fully engaged with the call? Are you listening intently, or is your mind on something that happened before the call, or something that happened yesterday or last week or last month or last year? Or alternatively, are you thinking of, geez, what am I going to have for my lunch? Or what am I going to do this evening? Or what's happening for the weekend? Or what have I on the agenda for next week? So our minds spend loads of time in the past and loads of time in the future. But when we can spend more time in the present moment, we have a far richer experience of the present moment. And as a result, we're far more engaged. And when we're far more engaged, we experience higher levels of well-being. And one of the main ways that we can boost our level of engagement is by the practice of meditation. Hands up, anyone who meditates or uses mindfulness. So a good few. Great stuff. So meditation is really, really calming and really, really soothing for our nervous systems. It benefits stress levels. It benefits us if we have anxiety. It's a really, really beneficial way for emotional control. And one of the main things that meditation does for us is that it opens up a gap between stimulus and response. And what that means is that oftentimes we have like an instinctual response to stuff. So for example, the traffic is heavy, so I'm getting stressed. I had a negative interaction with someone, and so I'm feeling sad. I'm really, really busy at work, so I'm very, very anxious. And when we spend more time in the present moment, we open up a gap between the stimulus and the response, and we get to choose our response rather than reacting reactively. So for example, the traffic is busy, and we open up a gap between that as a stimulus and the response that we have. So just because the traffic is busy, does that necessarily mean I have to get stressed? Just because someone said something to me that didn't suit me, do I have to feel sad about it? Just because I'm really busy at work, does that necessarily mean I have to be anxious about it? So when we're more mindful and when we're in the present moment, we get to choose our response rather than having this reflexive response. And you'd be aware of Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor and wrote a lovely book called Man's Search for Meaning. And he has a lovely quote that says, you know, between stimulus and response, there's a gap. And within that gap lies our freedom. And that's what he calls the last of the human freedoms, the freedom to choose your response in any given set of circumstances. So that's what meditation, mindfulness does for you. It increases your level of engagement. We know that when we're more engaged with our life, we have a far richer experience of our life and we experience higher levels of well-being. Okay. See what you see in there. Okay, so the R then stands for relationships. And we know that people who experience high levels of well-being are really, really good at their relationships and attach a high level of meaning and a high level of importance to their relationships. And, you know, evolution has hardwired every single one of us to connect with other people. And when we do joyfully connect with other people, we get a release of a chemical cocktail into our brains. Main one being oxytocin. Oxytocin is also known as your love hormone or your cuddle hormone. And this causes an immediate boost in our level of well-being. So working on our relationships, being aware of what our social network is, looking for ways that we can improve our interactions with other people, and becoming more other focused in our life is a really, really important tool and a really important technique when it comes to boosting your level of well-being. And there's loads of different tools and techniques for this also. For example, having an awareness or having an intention to commit acts of kindness or acts of compassion towards others gives the other person an immediate boost to their well-being. It gives you an immediate boost to your well-being. And one of the interesting things about kindness and compassion is that it also gives a boost to the well-being of an observer. So if you see someone doing something kind or compassionate for somebody else, the receiver, the giver, and also the observer receive a boost to their well-being. So kindness and compassion are really, really powerful as a way of boosting your relationships. And as we say, the number one thing you can do to boost your level of well-being is to work on your relationships. Hopefully that all makes sense to you. Now the M then stands for meaning. And the whole idea here is, does your life have a sense of meaning and purpose? And if it does, are you aware of what that is? And do your daily activities reflect that meaning and purpose? Because all too often, you know, we can be on this treadmill of life and we can be really, really busy and really stressed. And we get on this treadmill oftentimes at an early age. And oftentimes we don't even know we're on it. and we forget to get off it. And we're anxious and busy, and we're something completed, and we move on to the next thing, and then we move on to the next thing, and when that's completed, we move on to the next thing. But it's really important that we do take time out to pause and to reflect and to ask, well, what actually is my life all about, and what would I like it to be about? That eulogy exercise, I think, is a lovely, lovely exercise. You get to imagine what someone's going to say about you at your funeral. You find out what your values are, and then you go about living those values every day of your life. And that can be deeply, deeply meaningful for people. So the more sense of a meaning and a purpose that our lives has, the greater level of well-being that we'll experience. A stands for achievement or accomplishment. And this then brings us back to where we started off this morning, about the whole area of goals. So achievement and accomplishment is the whole idea of setting and working towards and achieving goals that are inherently important to you and inherently kind of motivating for you. So we did say at the outset that, the goals, of course, are really, really important. And you can see here that they do play an important element when it comes to our overall levels of well-being. But quite often we behave as if they were the only element and the only thing that's important when it comes to our success, happiness, and well-being. But you can see here they're just one pillar in a pillar of 6. Another important element here then is the whole area of habits. So habits can be hugely powerful in our lives. They say that 60% of what we do on a daily basis is determined not by conscious choice, but by habits. So we do something today because we did it yesterday and the day before and the day before and the day before. And to a certain extent, when we have that level of habits in our life, we're really kind of running a program. So we're just kind of doing stuff because we've always done it. And can you imagine the extent to which your life or your well-being could change if you decided that you were going to be conscious about your habits, and if you decided you were going to choose the habits rather than running the ones that are just there that you've kind of fallen into over the years? If you imagine the power of choosing your own habits and deciding, well, yes, I think I'm going to exercise every day, or I'm going to meditate every day, or I'm going to watch my diet, I'm going to commit kind acts to people. Can you imagine if you chose them as habits and the power that would have then in boosting your level of well-being? So habits is often an area that's neglected when it comes to that whole area of achievement and accomplishment. And something I'm kind of very fond of myself. Hopefully that all makes sense. And then the V in the whole PERMA V model stands for vitality. And vitality really means the energy you have to go about your daily business. And there's loads and loads of things that influence our level of vitality. But for me, there's 3 key ones. And the first one is exercise. So exercise should be key component for everyone's life at whatever level that they can exercise at. We know that exercise is just crucial from a physical health point of view, that it's really, really beneficial from a mental health point of view, and that it's often overlooked as a means of stress relief. Having all those chemicals building up in your body and circulating around in your body, the ability just to be able to go off for a run or a cycle or whatever your chosen exercise is and sweat out all those chemicals and reset your body back to a nice sense of calm and peace and ease. Really, really important. The second area that's important for our vitality is, of course, our diet. We can't forget that our bodies are constantly regenerating and constantly renewing, and that's a process that's going on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And for your body to regenerate and for your body to renew, it needs raw materials. And the raw materials come from the oxygen we breathe and from the food we eat. And so it's really important that we eat high quality foods and a good balanced diet. And the third element that's really, really important then when it comes to our vitality is the whole area of sleep. And that idea of having some downtime. Like sleep is more about just rest. Our brains remain active during most of our sleeping cycle. And we know that sleep is really important for our brains, that it's beneficial for our hearts, it's beneficial for our lungs, it affects our metabolism, it affects our immune system, it affects our mood. And when we don't get enough sleep, that lack of sleep has been linked to increased blood pressure, to poor cardiovascular health, to obesity. So really, really important for sleep. So those are the 3 elements that are important when it comes to our vitality. And sometimes, the more I read about it, the more I think that we could also maybe include the whole area of our breath and our breathing and how we use our breathing. So the pace of our breath, the depth of our breath, and the quality of our breath has a huge influence on our level of vitality and on our levels of energy. So that's the PermaV model. I really like that, because it's a little package that we can use. And sometimes with well-being, we can hear all these different opinions as to, what will help and what won't help. But I love the idea of having a format and a roadmap and having a bit of science behind it so that we know if we do invest our time in those different tools that we will actually see a boost to our overall level of well-being. And from it, we can also see, that well-being then isn't, or happiness is not something necessarily that we pursue, but something that we practice on a daily basis. And the way we practice this is by committing to tools and techniques and habits that we use on as I say, a daily basis. So people often look for a magic bullet, or often look for the secret to well-being. But the reality of it is that improvements to our well-being doesn't necessarily demand these enormous lifestyle changes. But this doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have to go off to the Himalayas and sit in a cave for 6 months meditating and you'll come back enlightened and the job is done. It's all about the consistent application of small daily habits. And oftentimes we can be fooled by this because we think, oh, sure, that's such a small habit. How could that possibly make a difference? That's not going to take me 2 minutes. How could 2 minutes influence my level of well-being or my level of happiness or my level of life satisfaction? And that's how we can easily be fooled. So the consistent application of small daily habits, when we do them consistently and when we stack one little habit on another little habit and another little habit, it's like availing of the benefits of compound interest or availing of the benefits of exponential growth. So if you look at the beginning of this graph here, you can see that those 3 lines are almost identical. And as time goes on a little bit, you could say they're almost parallel, but not quite. But with the passage of time, you can see that they diverge into completely different directions. And so the blue line there is when we apply small, consistent daily habits stacked one on top of another, you can see they bring you to a completely different destination when it comes to your well-being, compared to the black line, which means you don't take any action at all, or the red line is when you're consistently making choices that are a small bit detrimental to your happiness, your health, your well-being. And so we call this the power of 1% gains. So I always say, not to be fooled by thinking that, that's too small. How could that possibly make a difference? That these things do make a difference once they're applied on a consistent basis. And so it brings us neatly back to this one that I said, this one is key to everything that we were going to talking about today. In the blurb to this talk, I asked the question, how would you like if 2021 was the year that it all changed for you? How would you like to set the only goal that really, really matters? And what I was hoping to do today really was to kind of convince you that the only goal that really, really matters is that we work on our level of well-being and our level of happiness and our level of life satisfaction, that we realize that those things don't revolve around our success, but that it's the exact opposite that happens, that our success revolves around our levels of well-being and our levels of happiness. And so wouldn't it be great if 2021 was the year where you made enormous strides in boosting your well-being and you committed this year maybe to the year that you were going to focus on your well-being? Because sometimes, when we're dissatisfied and we've low mood and we're disengaged and our relationships aren't great and we've low energy and vitality, a new car or a new house or a promotion at work isn't going to change any of those things. If those things apply before you have a new car or a promotion, they're going to apply after you have a new car or a promotion. And what I hope we've seen over the last hour or so is that when we boost our level of well-being, that has a positive impact on almost every single domain that we can measure in our life, whether that's our health, our personal life, or business life. And by boosting our level of well-being and by letting that be your focus, that gives you a foundation or gives you a launch pad to achieve whatever success it is that you want to achieve in your life or whatever your particular goals are. So last little question then for you is, if you really were committed to improving your level of well-being or to boosting your level of well-being, in your own personal case, what is one thing that you could stop doing, something you're currently doing that isn't really benefiting your well-being or your happiness? So is there something that you could commit to stop doing? Secondly, is there some small little step that you could commit to start doing? So we don't want to bite off more than we can chew, but is there something small that we could apply to our lives that we could say, do you know what, if I actually, this is something I've been meaning to do for a while, but I've never really got around to it, and I always seem to be putting it off. There's something small, a small little step that you could start doing. And just be very conscious of that power of 1% growth. It doesn't have to be life-changing. Small little steps, something that might only take you a couple of minutes a day, but just commit to doing this every day and being consistent with it. And then finally, we're all doing things that are beneficial to our health, our happiness, and our well-being. And what is the one thing that I'm going to commit to continue doing? Something maybe I've taken up and I find that really does benefit me when it comes to my health, my happiness, my well-being, my life satisfaction, and I'm going to commit to continue doing that. So a couple of questions for you to ponder there. And guys, that is it for me. That's all I really wanted to say to you guys. I want to really, really thank you. I hope your reactions as enthusiastic as these little guys here. I want to really, really thank you for your attention, and I hope you found it helpful and I hope you found it beneficial. If there are any questions that you've had, I've just put in jokingly there, no hard ones, please. Because I do think it's important that we realize that this is a journey that people are on. There's no one who has it all solved, no one who has all the answers, and I'm very much in that post as well. I'm really interested in this topic, but it's something that I'm constantly working on. So if you have any questions, if you want to take yourself off mute, if you have any questions, bang ahead. Do I see Yvonne's hand up there? Yvonne says no. So any questions, anyone's guys, or comments, or anything you found interesting, or?
Séamus, I just want to thank you for that. That was great. With regards to the, and just to contribute, for the stop doing, for me, it's big about not reacting to the day. So as the day comes on, you open your email. So having a structure and having the guideline on those 6 points are great for me. I love the fact that I can lay out my day, and also keeps your awareness about it if you plan it a little bit. So for me, the stop doing part is not just reacting to everything that comes into my email box or the staff getting on to me or whatever the case would be. So that's really something I'm going to do. So thanks for that. Great, enjoyed it. Thank you.
Lovely, John. Thanks, man. I love that as well. I think it's really empowering to know that, if we are aware in the present moment that we do have the ability to choose our response to things. And sometimes we think things happen so fast and we think, well, that's just a natural response and that's a reflective response. And that does happen, but we do, once we're aware, once we're living in the present, we do open up that gap between stimulus and response. And, we guess a couple of seconds maybe to say, well, am I actually going to respond like that? Or will I choose a more appropriate response? So I love that too, John. Yeah. Linda?
Séamus, thank you very much. That was absolutely excellent. I really enjoyed it.
Good,
when
Linda.
you talked about that stimulus and response, it's very, very interesting that we can choose, if we can get that gap, that we can choose how we react. And you mentioned meditation or mindfulness. Now, I've tried it and I've never really stuck with it. Is there any tips you have or any little app that you think would be a good one to start with for someone who finds it hard?
Yeah, so I think the most common thing I find with mindfulness or meditation, it was a real kind of eye-opener for me, or a real aha moment for me is, people often say to me exactly what you said, I love mindfulness, I'd love to practice this, but I tried it for a while and I just can't do it. You know why? Because my mind keeps wandering and I just can't cope with it. My mind keeps wandering, I can't focus. And the idea with mindfulness or meditation is that as a beginner or as an expert or as someone who's been practicing mindfulness or meditation for 30 years, everyone's minds wander. So the nature of your mind is to wander. And your job in meditation is not to clear your mind or to have no thoughts. Your only job in meditation is you bring your focus into the present moment, and we usually do that by focusing on our breathing. And your mind will wander, and not to feel bad when so you don't judge yourself because your mind wanders. You don't say, I can't do this, this isn't working. Your mind will wander, and it could wander, and after 2 seconds you might notice, or after 2 minutes you might notice. But when you notice, all you do is bring your attention back to the present moment, bring your attention back to your breathing. So that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong or you can't do it. That happens to everyone. So the whole act of meditation, that is mindfulness, that is meditation. So it's like when you go to the gym, you lift a weight. It's no good lifting this once, you lift it repeatedly. And each time you lift it, you're building up a muscle in your arm, for example. And it's the same with mindfulness and meditation. Each time you notice your mind has wandered, you bring it back. Each time you notice your mind is wandered, you bring it back. Each time your mind is wandered, you bring it back. So just because your mind is wandered doesn't mean you can't do it. It means that you're doing this exactly correctly and you're doing this exactly the right way. And the whole idea is when you notice it's gone, bring it back. So it's just a matter of sticking with it, Lyndon. I think maybe deciding on a small amount of time, not deciding I'm going to do 20 minutes or half an hour today, like even 5 minutes of mindfulness or 5 minutes of meditation on a daily basis is beneficial. And that little muscle builds up on you so that you do notice your mind wandering sooner and you bring it back sooner. But it's a whole idea of realizing that that is what happens to everyone. And it's not just you that happens to, that happens to everyone. And just when it happens, bring it back. When it happens, bring it back. Okay. You just get more used to this. Yeah.
Thank you, Séamus.
Thank you, Lynn. Anyone else, anything, guys? No? We're all happy. So listen, guys, thanks very, very much. And I really appreciate you coming out this morning. And I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it helpful. My contact details are on that final slide there. So if this is something that you want more information or more advice on, or anything else I can do for you in this whole area of well-being, I'd be more than delighted to. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day and a lovely weekend. And thanks so much for showing up, guys.
Thanks,
you.
Séamus.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, James.
Thank you, Séamus.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Séamus. Thank you.